I think in the future, learning will be more open and more accessible and more varied, so that more people are able to learn in different ways and for different purposes across the lifespan, so that learning will be life-wide and lifelong. We might argue that learning has always been available, but often it was available in fairly narrow forms and to perhaps only a small section of the population worldwide. Learning will be more accessible, more open and more available freely to everyone at any time and for any reason.
There will be big changes in learning that will come down the line, and some of that is around the structures that we have in terms of a degree, looking at micro-credentials, just-in-time training, and the way that education is getting, I suppose, packaged into smaller kind of samples.
The future of learning is online and digital, because we need to follow and adapt to and be proactive with the UNESCO and United Nations development goals, especially in education, number 4, but also that the SDG 4 have influences and impact on all the other SDGs. And the only way forward is online to reach the education for all.
So the future of learning is likely to be much more flexible, more blended, more hybrid across the continuum of formal and informal learning. I think in terms of the process and who is involved in the learning process, I think we're going to see many more stakeholders involved. So it will be in higher education, academics working with learning designers and other stakeholders to make learning more engaging, and especially as it goes more online.
Outside of higher education and of other formal education, we're going to see online learning and online pedagogies coming into play within industry. Again, we can see that with some of the big industry players like IBM, Amazon. They're investing in education for their staff and their employees, and I think we're going to see more organizations utilizing online learning. The current model is often that people are spending a number of days attending workshops. That disrupts their whole work process by making certainly the theoretical elements available online that staff can do in their own time, and then perhaps coming for shorter workshops where they actually participate in activities that reinforce that theory. We're going to see those kind of changes. So it was just-in-time training for industry, and industry requirements will become a much bigger user of online education.
So away from higher education, online learning gives many more organisations such as NGOs and businesses the opportunity to upskill their employees or their target audiences. And so I think that there's potential for collaboration between universities and other organisations. So perhaps it's not so much that online learning will take away students from higher education, but that there will be opportunities for more authentic collaborations and curriculum development going forward.
Outside of the higher education context, online learning can be useful to people across their lifespan, from childhood right through to older adults post-retirement, for any purpose, whether that be employment related, upskilling, credentialing, retraining, but also for reasons that are personal and spiritual and to do with hobbies and self-actualization in the widest possible form. Online learning can cater for any learning, for any person, for any reason.
Welcome to today's session, part of the week-long FutureLearn Festival of Learning. Mental health is one of the biggest challenges the education sector currently faces, and the pressures applied by the current pandemic have highlighted where further support is desperately needed. In this 4-way question and answer session, we will consider how educators can support the mental well-being of students, colleagues, and themselves, particularly during times of crisis. So it's my pleasure to introduce our 4 panelists to help navigate us through this, answering questions along the way. So please do ask questions now in the live chat, and I'll be picking them up throughout the session. So joining us today on the panel is Dr. Vanessa Putz, researcher and senior teaching fellow in developmental neuroscience and psychopathology at University College London in the UK. Vanessa has investigated how childhood maltreatment can impact on children's development. She is also lead educator on the FutureLearn course, Childhood Adversity, the Impact of Childhood Maltreatment on Mental Health from UCL. Welcome. We have Jonathan Bagley with us, Chief Executive of the PSHE Association, the National Association for Personal Social Health Economic Education in the UK. PSHE education is a subject through which pupils develop the knowledge, skills, and attributes they need to manage their lives now and in the future. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you.
We also have with us Dr. Paul Lindsley, a senior lecturer in mental health nursing at the University of East Anglia in the UK. Paul has worked largely in acute and forensic mental health settings, both as a clinician and as a manager. He is registered as a clinical specialist in acute psychiatry and is trained in cognitive behavioural therapy. He teaches on a number of courses at UEA and is lead educator on the FutureLearn course, Anxiety in Children and Young People during COVID-19. And we have Dr. Caroline Ruckert, Director of Student Success at the Learning and Teaching Unit of Queensland University of Technology in Melbourne, in Australia. So welcome, Caroline, and welcome everybody to this panel. So as I say, this is a four-way question and answer panel. So please do ask your questions in live stream and I'll be picking them up. So I'll be kicking off with the first question, which is, from your own perspectives, what's been the impact of lockdown on the mental well-being of students, especially after such an abrupt closure of campuses, colleges and schools? So Vanessa, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think at the moment, this is really difficult for us to say what the impact is going to be, because I think people have had vastly different experiences. But from my own experience with my own students, I would say that most students feel very lonely. This has been quite an abrupt ending. So this is, of course, nothing that we would otherwise have experienced. And so they're having less contact with their peers. And, you know, that can lead to loneliness, that can exacerbate pre-existing mental health issues. And yeah, I mean, on a more practical level, they also have less access to resources. So it's also a disruption, not just a disruption to the social network and their peer support system, but it's also a disruption to the resources that they would otherwise have access to, such as counseling services, etc., etc. For some of the students, I also feel it's really important to point out that learning is disrupted as well, because in many countries, my students are really challenged with, for example, bandwidth and the different time zones. So they can't learn as they did when they were in person with us. So I think the impact is quite far-reaching in the domains of social contact and social support to learning, to mental health and well-being.
Thank you. And Caroline, do you have anything to add to this from your perspective?
One of the things I've noticed is for many of and I work in a university context, a real significant impact on students' sense of motivation and sense of purpose. And very practical things like students struggling to manage their time in this new environment. And what we've seen is also that the equity gap has gotten significantly wider for many cohorts, and especially for those students who are coming, who live complex life circumstances. Many of them have had their income and livelihoods disrupted. Many of our students work part-time. They've had that disrupted. And many of our students are also coming from more relational cultures. And in that context, they're often in home environments where they have one computer with multiple families, and then, you know, families having to negotiate work at the same time that there are students also having to navigate various kinds of learning. So we've had to think really outside of the box. How do we address those inequity issues in a timely way? So those would be some of the things that I've noticed have been some of the challenges.
Thank you. And Paul, from your perspective, what have you seen to be the effects?
Well, I think what we need to consider is what students have had to contend with as part of lockdown, and be mindful of that as people return back to study. So really hits home when you hear student stories about what they've had to meet at home. So students have had to, as well as study, had to cope with things like loss and bereavement, challenging situations at home, a parent being made redundant, for example. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future. What does that future look like? And things around friendship and bullying, that loss of contact, bullying on social media, and this idea that it's safer at home. And really, it's about adjusting and learning to live with risk. I think that's the next big thing, and recognizing that risk is ever present, and we somehow navigated that risk before going into lockdown, and that's something we've got to bear in mind when students return.
Thank you. And Jonathan, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I mean, just to agree with everything that's been said, really, but just to add, I think Vanessa's point, it is too early to know, what the long-term impact is, and we can't make sort of large generalizations. But one thing that the pandemic has definitely highlighted, certainly in this country and globally, is vast inequalities in access to resources, in home setups, in the different vulnerabilities that young people have. So I think for educators, when students start coming back into schools, very much about starting where young people are, getting a sense of the experiences that they've had, so that you can really try to put in place programs that are responding to their lived experiences.
Thank you. Thank you. So we've just touched on some of the solutions, but I'd like to ask a question around what guidance, practical solutions educators can do now to help support the mental well-being of students in response to what's just happened to them in the last few months. So really, those practical tips and support strategies would be great. So could we go to Paul first with this?
Okay. Well, one of the things that's interesting me at the moment is around creating psychologically safe environments. So, for instance, I walked past my local school the other day, and there was lots of signs up about the risk and measures to control that risk, and it felt quite threatening. And I think when you see these signs of risk, when we look to create a psychologically safe environment, this idea of actually incorporating some norm into and welcoming and a sense of comfort, so breaking up these signs and trying to reconnect with what is the familiar, and a smile goes a long, long way. So we're living with risk, we're living with danger at the minute. And we're seeing that constantly. And as we go from this crisis phase into recovery, I think one of the things we have to be mindful of is to try and create a safe but comforting environment, a welcoming environment, and ensure that we connect with students. And that means that, we're all going to have off days, and giving them that allowance. And what I've started to do as part of my teaching is the first 10 minutes or so is just to connect and just to check out and see if people are okay, how they're functioning, how they're coping. So it's just being available, open, engaging, and trying to see beyond the risk and bring a bit of connectivity back.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Jonathan, you were touching on this when you were talking about the impact. Do you have practical support strategies that can help?
Yeah, I mean, I think Paul's brilliantly highlighted just how comprehensive institutional responses need to be, right down to the level of the physical environment, the sort of signage that you have in place, the way in which the physical environment actually creates a sense of safety and a sense of security for young people. I think just looking at the school context, when we're thinking about mental health and emotional well-being, clearly it's got to be a whole school approach to the issue. So that's looking at the physical environment, looking at behavior policies, looking at staff training, looking at the way in which staff and people relate to one another and the sort of norms that are encouraged. And then within that, there's the role of the curriculum. And for those of you internationally, you might not have come across PSHE. It's effectively the curriculum that contains things like health education, so physical and mental health, relationships and sex, and what we tend to call kind of living in the wider world, which is, careers, financial capability, economic well-being, really providing the knowledge and skills young people need to navigate their daily lives and their futures. And I suppose when we're thinking about how the curriculum can respond to the needs of young people as we move into a recovery phase, I think initially we will be looking at curriculum that is a place for more of a sort of, I suppose, therapeutic focus, where we're providing that opportunity for young people to talk about the experiences that they've had in a safe way, think about anxiety, think about skills and strategies to recognize perhaps physical signs of anxiety and things that they can do. But I think in the longer term, we need to consider what the curriculum can do this year and in the years to come to make sure that young people feel prepared for the challenges of the economic challenges of the future, but also feel a sense of control. So PSHE covers all sorts of areas of their lives, and the aim is really to give them a sense of agency when faced with all the different decisions that they might be faced with. And I think if there's one thing that will be, you can say all young people and all of us have experienced in some sense, is some kind of loss, even if that's just a loss of control in your daily lives. So I think we've got plenty of guidance on our website. We've got some forthcoming guidance on exactly these issues, but I think it is about thinking the whole school environment and then specifically what can we do.
Thank you, that's very helpful. So go to Vanessa, do you have some support, practical support tips?
Absolutely. We've been thinking about this a lot with our students, because we have a lot of international students, and they've gone really far away to their home countries now. And in order to keep in touch and how to support them, and I can only echo what Paul and Jonathan have said before me, that one of the most important things is to create a safe space in the school or in the university, or in the university context, even if it's digital, for students to really express their worry, for us to acknowledge these worries are real and to normalize these worries, because the situation is unprecedented. We can't assume that every student has had the same experience. So we really need to create a space where students can talk about their experiences and their different opinions about that. So really the safe space in the school, I think this is the first and foremost important thing to support our students. But then there's also other things schools and universities can do. And I think one of the most important things is to communicate clearly in a predictable manner. So I want to say frequent, but I think sometimes this has been misunderstood with bombarding staff and students with emails. This is clearly not how we reduce stress, but in a predictable way, so that the communication can be expected, say, once a day, and parents and students know exactly where they're at. They feel they're communicated with in a direct way. However, you need to ensure that this is done via multiple channels, on paper, via telephone, email, so that you reach really all families. So communication, I would say, is the really second very important bit. And in this regard, the communication, of course, when you talk to younger children, needs to be appropriate. And this leads me to another point, and that's us adults in teaching, educating functions. We really need to model the kind of behavior we want to instill in a way that I think we need to be calm, and we need to communicate also quite openly about the situation. So, for example, in my case, I have tried to calm the students down by creating a routine and by trying to create something that's old and familiar in this new situation. So we continued to keep our time as much as time zones allowed. We continued the teaching, we continued the personal tutor meetings and pastoral care at the same time points as they would have expected it to be. So routine is probably for students one of the most important things, going back to what Jonathan and Paul said about predictability and really like not knowing what to do with their time. So it's important that they have something to look forward to, and they know that they can communicate with us. And I think then the last thing that I think is really, really important to think about is to encourage young people, but also adolescents and ourselves, to be really critical with the kind of news sources that we use. So I think, whilst young people keep in touch with their peers via social media, the amount of content that's on there is sometimes really abysmal and can create even more anxiety, panic, wrong information. And I think as teachers and educators, it's probably also a good idea if we want to support our young people and the students we teach to really point out, how does it make you feel when you read this? Like, is this a trustworthy news source or is it not? So to really instill that kind of critical thinking so that students really don't get bombarded with all these news that are potentially anxiety provoking. I think that would be a support as well.
Thank you, Vanessa. That's very helpful. And Caroline, do you have guidance for practical support strategies for students?
I'll add a couple of things on. I think I would agree, absolutely, communication being essential, but actually communication also the other way. I think one of the things we're learning is the importance of having really robust feedback channels, so that so we could get an understanding as educators of what's not working, and being able to then go back to our students and say, you've said this, we've done this. That's been really important to help, I think, build trust and confidence, in addition to that regular communication. The other thing that I think we've learned, and that I think is really important at this stage, is also I would agree to take a to think about things in a much more holistic, interconnected way, and to build in strategic opportunities for connectedness, and connectedness in a range of different ways, connectedness student to staff member, but also looking at the ways in which you can embed more peer-to-peer learning into the learning environment. What we found at the university is, whereas before COVID-19 hit, students often would want one-on-one consultations, and there was for us a massive uptake of group-based learning. And what we found is, where students were really grieving, it was the little conversations that they were often having on the side, that they had lost the ability. I've got an assignment coming up, I want to check with my colleague next to me or my peer next to me, and not being able to do those little informal communications. So thinking about how to do that in a more strategic way. And I think the other thing that we've learned is not waiting until there's a problem. So not seeing mental health from a deficit or a reactionary point of view, but really designing to support students. And so, where are the students going to be struggling? Where are those threshold moments in their learner journeys? And then making sure the support is right there when they need it. And the support is synchronous, asynchronous, it's flexible, but it's also useful and relevant to the task at hand. I found that students get very frustrated when we send them to more generic supports. They want support that's really responsive to their challenges. And then just finally, going back to the comment I made around motivation, I think there's an assumption that a lot of times students know what it means to self-direct their own learning. And what I found, regardless of whether you've got a child in year 4, which I do, or a university student, be really clear on our expectations of what learning needs to look like and what's expected of them. Because when we're struggling with motivation, we're struggling with time management, that has come up as a real challenge, I think, in the learner environment.
Thank you. That's all really, really helpful. So my next question is around spotting sort of signs where students may be needing support with their mental health, well-being. And I know that you all have your different expertise, so it would be great to go to Paul first around what kind of signs can we look out for as educators to enable us to see where people may be struggling, so that we can put support systems in place.
Well, I think as I've said to you in our conversations prior to this, that the one key indicator for me is any departure from the child's normal behaviour of functioning, and that really for me is an indicator that we need to be questioning and quizzical and looking to see if the child is having difficulties. So really any departure from the child's normal behaviour over certainly over a period of a couple of days, because we're all entitled to have an off day, but it's then how that change of behaviour is then impacting on their ability to function. So if the child is irritable, lacking in motivations, not sleeping, finding it hard to concentrate. Maybe if they're suffering from anxiety, they might be fidgety, wanting to go to the toilet, complaining of stomachache and whatever. Anything from the norm, then we need to be questioning. And certainly if it goes over a few days, then we need to start, saying to the child, is there things that are amiss, and can we be of help?
Thank you. Would anybody else like to add to that?
I can add maybe something about, young people who are already quite vulnerable. So when we look at children who are in care, so I think this is basically echoing what Paul just said. And I think when you look at children in care, they've already faced quite a lot of adversity in their lives. And for them, this kind of, sudden loss of community, peers, and, stability can be incredibly stressful. And that might trigger further feelings of fear and anxiety. So with young people in care, or more generally young people who come with vulnerabilities, pre-existing vulnerabilities, I think sometimes we see that these children also would deviate from the known behavior and are either much more withdrawn or become quite angry. So any deviation from the behavior that you know from this child is something that would indicate that something is on their minds. And yeah, I mean, of course, not all children will feel the same way, as we said many times today, but it's really important to really sit down and inquire, whereas, and inquire what the child is thinking and why the behavior is changing, why the child is withdrawn, why the young person is feeling angry or is snappy at you, and what's really behind that.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who would like to add to that?
I know I've just had my turn, but I think picking up Jonathan's earlier point about the curriculum playing an important part, and rethinking about the way we teach. So not only encouraging space, but in a sense, future-proofing. So building things like emotional resilience, building emotional intelligence, looking at skills that improve our ability to cope, such as critical and problem solving skills, social awareness, things like empathy, teamwork, recognizing when we're, say, experience anxiety, exploring our thoughts around anxiety, and looking at things like optimism and attitude. So these are things that we could work on and so, if you like, future-proof. So that if we do go into a second wave, that the students are more equipped. And we read a lot about students lacking life skills for various reasons. So there is a lot we could do on that side of things.
Thank you.
If I can just add to that, I would just say I absolutely agree. And I think really important as well to recognise that these are things which need to be embedded right through the curriculum from sort of the beginning of a child's journey into school right up till the end. If we think about teaching about emotional well-being and mental health, you can't really start teaching about sort of mental health issues with older sort of, with teens if in primary you haven't developed those basic skills about understanding feelings, naming emotions, managing conflicting emotions, those sorts of things. So as in all areas of, as in any other subject, you wouldn't start teaching maths with sort of compound interest if you hadn't done basic numeracy. So again, I think it just highlights there's a huge amount we need to do to respond to this pandemic. There's a lot that we must do just to generally equip young people for these sorts of events and just the daily challenges and opportunities that they face.
Thank you.
And I noticed in the chat, somebody asks, can activities that develop positive mental health be shared practice for adults and children? I think what's come across this morning is that one size doesn't fit all. And we've got to look at our population, our students, and their student needs. And I think what all's good for children, all's good for ourselves, and that we can always develop our emotional intelligence, our resilience, and certainly when it comes to coping, like a lot of these things, there is skills that you can look to develop, and skills can be practiced, and sometimes they prove fruitful, and really it's adding to your skill set, if you like, and practicing it. So yeah, so in answer to Paul's question, I think there's some things that are good to share, and when you look at things like connectivity, so although children look to us and we hope to role model calm behaviours and whatever, sometimes it's okay to say, well, actually we're not okay, but we can look at it together or tackle that problem together, and I can learn from this shared experience. So sometimes I think there's that honest conversation, and these are, we're all learning, and that's the sort of conversation we could have with our students.
Thank you. We have a question in from Ina Shabram Beaton. How do you welcome new students entering school after the summer? With older students, you're able to rely on previously built connections, but what with new students? This is not possible. So I would love to have your thoughts on that. Can I turn to Caroline to begin?
Well, I think, first of all, so I work in a university context, so I'll answer it within that. But I think having a strategy where you've scaffolded the transition in, one of the things I think is, again, using peer-to-peer connections and connecting students to their peers even before they arrive. That can be a really powerful tool. The other thing that I think I see a lot of universities do that can also be quite important is having the students self-reflect on their transition journey. What are they worried about? What do they need help with? So for example, at the university I work at, we actually reach out to students and we invite them to self-assess their own readiness. And then based on that, we actually then have a scaffolded strategy. So for those students who are really worried or concerned or feeling disconnected, we'll respond to that need in a more situated way. If a student's feeling really confident, then, for example, we might direct them to some self-help resources. So I think scaffolding the connectedness, building in that sense of readiness and peer-to-peer learning, but then also seeing the transition in as not just do they have the academic skills, but really looking at programming and strategies that help build self-efficacy, self-confidence, and help build social connectedness. Those would be, I think, some of the key things. Connections to peers, and then also connections in particular to teaching staff, that the folks that are going to be teaching them, that they are there to support them. And again, right from the get-go, trying to build trust between the students and their and the folks that are going to be facilitating their learning.
Thank you. Would anybody like to add to that?
I think it might also be beneficial to increase, for example, the staff-student contact with new students in the beginning. So in order to build a relationship of trust, that the student really feels picked up and that the student feels heard, as a new student as well, with new worries and potentially also being quite confused about the normal routines at the school. So this is probably a case where increased staff support might be beneficial.
Thank you. Sorry.
I was just going to add one other thing. I think it can be incredibly powerful is also using storytelling as a tool. So, often when students are transitioning into a new school, that sense of, hope, but also that sense of uncertainty, and having students who have been there and through that experience share their stories, share those moments of vulnerability, but share stories that are very much framed within growth mindset, where the journey wasn't 100% smooth, but they did come out the other end stronger, more confident. Real stories, I think, make a tremendous difference, and also for teaching staff to see themselves not just as educators, but also as storytellers, that they too are learners, and sharing those experiences of learning, I think, can be a very powerful way of normalizing anxiety and worries that students might have, and again, seeing any concerns that they have as normalizing it as part of the learner journey.
Thank you. We have a question almost the other way from Marga Carr. How can you support learners when you're a supply teacher and you've not lived this unprecedented event with the students. So you're new to the students when you'll be teaching next school year. So does anybody have an answer to that? Would anybody like to come first?
Sorry.
Sorry.
So how can you support learners when you're a supply teacher and you've not lived this unprecedented event with the students you will be teaching next school year?
I suppose I would look at this in two elements. One is it depends on the curriculum element. If you're teaching PSHE, for example, and you're teaching a subject where you are directly engaging in the experiences that young people may have had, that there are strategies you can deploy to find out in a safe way from them where they're at in their experience. So, using sort of baseline assessment strategies at the beginning of lessons to find out their thoughts and feelings about an issue, and providing some teaching, and then revisiting those to see where they've moved to, and identifying areas of concern and misconceptions. So that's in a sort of curriculum sense. Obviously, it is going to be harder in terms of those general relationships as a member of the school body. And again, it comes back, I suppose, to the importance of the schools and universities and institutions themselves taking a holistic approach to this, and making sure that there are very clear routines, clear training, clear policies around the way in which you're going to discuss these issues and relate to young people as well. So I can certainly see additional challenges, but I would hope that actually the schools would take the mantle there and make sure that supply teachers or anyone coming into the schools had a sense of the way in which the school was tackling this, so that there is that sense of continuity, structure, and predictability for young people.
Thank you.
And I think it then comes back down to the individual teacher and being open, approachable, and curious. So wanting to develop relationships with their pupils and get to understand, and that has proved real benefits when with this checking in and at the start of each lesson, and I think when we look at adjustment, for example, it's about giving people the time to adjust. So we can't expect to just run schools the same way that we did prior to lockdown, and pupils just respond. It might even be things like walking through the new routine, but time, getting to know the person, being open, approachable, and having that emotional curiosity, and making space where people can students can discuss their concerns. I think that's really, you can only be sensitive, but it puts more emphasis on you if you've not got that relationship.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And we've talked a lot about students, but what can we also put in place to help support educators, the teachers at the higher education institutes, the colleges and schools? What can we do to support them and their colleagues through this and beyond? So Vanessa or Caroline.
Yes. Caroline, you go.
Okay, I think one of the things is just to recognise that it is a transition for staff as well, and at least in Australia, we had, I think, 2 weeks to go 100% online and to completely flip our model. So one of the things I think we found was first carving out time for staff to actually do that work, and supporting staff capabilities around learning in different environments. But what I found really powerful was also having staff helping each other. So once we had achieved sort of a certain baseline of support, what we noticed is a lot of staff started to self-initiate, so supporting staff autonomy, but also creating space for connection was really, really important. So we talked about consistency of communication. I think also consistency around building in times for staff to connect with each other, to work through problems. So for example, with my team, I have a stand-up now while the crisis was hitting every morning, and we had a check-in and a check-out, and that meant we were all in it together, working through issues that were coming up, but also having a bit of fun with the online connection, and building a bit of lightness into the day. So having, for example, coffee check-ins, which seems on the one hand trivial, but it also allowed us to get to know each other. And if I were to step back and say, what has this last 6 months enabled, it's made me feel much more connected to the people I work with, which is surprising given that at the same time we've also struggled with motivation and loneliness.
Thank you.
Yeah, I concur with Caroline, and yeah, I think first and foremost, having some social, checkup with each other is a good idea. But I think more generally, it might be beneficial if after this lockdown, there is some emotional well-being screening done with teaching staff, and just to see how they're faring actually, and how they've been doing. Because a lot of us have been quite overwhelmed with, bringing our teaching online, so acquiring all of these new technological skills, and on top of that, still providing all the pastoral care for our students. So I think on top of that comes our personal situation in lockdown. So it would be good to really keep that in mind, check in with the staff. I think really important things are for staff to not overwhelm yourself with how you deliver your teaching. Back to basics is the key point here. Do less, but do it well. Don't try to, design and develop really elaborate, high bandwidth, super complicated learning activities, which are going to stress you and your students out. But instead really get back to your learning objectives and have a think, what do I really need to teach? What do I want my students to know? And design a simple yet efficient activity around that, and take yourself stress off yourself. The other thing I want to say is increased supervision by your line managers is probably also important, so that staff can really talk about their situations. A lot of my colleagues have caring responsibilities. I can see how difficult that is on top of all the things that are already going on. And I can only say I'm in awe of how many people have managed this situation. However, this has a toll, and I think increased supervision so they feel heard is really important. But then, just really practical things. I can only speak of a couple of things that our leadership implemented at the Anna Freud Center, and that's, for example, walk and talk meetings, so that meetings can be on the telephone while you have a walk through the park. You don't have to sit behind your desk all the time. It can also be combined sometimes, if you don't need to look at a screen, with just a walk around. And because time outside is valuable when you're sitting behind a screen for so long. The other thing is, how long are your meetings? Another thing we do is now a 40-minute meeting break, so that everybody has time between meetings to just get a cup of tea and just come down and have a break between all these meetings. The most important of all of that, though, I think, and this is something that's really important in our workplace too, is anti-stigma awareness. Like, staff needs to feel safe and supported to talk about mental health issues, and to talk about to their line managers, but also their colleagues. And of course, what's key here is that anti-stigma is really, really at the forefront of what leadership communicates in educational sector. This is not just true for staff, this is also true for our students. Our students also need to know and need to be communicated that there is no stigma around mental health issues, and that they should come forward with it. That's the practical things I experienced as beneficial for staff.
Thank you. Has anybody got anything else to add to that?
I was just going to agree with everybody about it's okay for staff not to be okay. Mm-hmm. And we've got to provide opportunities for them to be able to safely do that. Because there is this thing about we have to be seen to be coping, and that we're professionals and we're leaders and what have you. But one of the most liberating experiences over this COVID was actually a line manager of mine actually saying, I'm having a rough day. I'm not managing this, and it was just great that I felt privileged that it shared that with me. But we've got to start looking out for each other and be mindful that, yes, like many of us, we're having to cope with various demands and giving us the space to do that. And I noticed Chris Johnson wrote about the importance of psychological first aid, and certainly that's something that we're promoting with staff for the return of campus. So having people who are trained in that, and then using peer support much more readily. So yeah, so giving us the time and space and the ability to say, I'm not okay.
Thank you. So the question from Chris Johnston was, I work in disaster management in healthcare and have advocated for psychological first aid as a core skill that all staff and volunteers should be taught. Would you agree that PFA is also a core skill that teachers and school staff should be trained in going forward? Lots of nods.
Certainly. Mostly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's not just that they have the training, but they see it that mental health and well-being is everybody's responsibility in the school, and that everybody has a role to play in it, and creating a culture where that's a lived reality.
Yeah.
And what's been nice, sorry, I just cut across that. I think what's been nice is a sense of community. And conversely, I've actually found out quite a few things that I didn't know about colleagues, and that's been great to have different conversations about things like hobbies and interests, and funny enough, that's gone down well with the students as well when they find out little facets. So, for instance, I disclosed once that I collect West German pottery. So with a particular group, I've got to show them my latest addition to my collection, or and then they make a judgment.
So we have 3 minutes remaining, and I'd like to end on a positive note, and we're moving towards that. What are the positives that we can take from this? The things that you've seen students and educators take on board, skills they've gained, that we can build on moving forward. See, making things easier for the future.
One thing that I've seen is the current environment has really facilitated a willingness to try stuff. Something didn't work, we tried it, and that willingness to say, okay, we're going to stop that, we're going to try something new. So a more curious approach to supporting learning. I think that's been really good. The other thing that I think I've seen that's been really powerful also is through that enhanced connectedness, also practicing more deliberate moments of gratitude, and giving each other also more strength-based feedback, because I think that's been really important for morale building.
Thank you. Would anybody like to add to that?
I think a clear thing to think about looking back as sort of what story do we tell about the pandemic, and whilst we absolutely need to normalize the fact that this is deeply worrying for all of us and causes a huge amount of anxiety, but do we tell a story of sort of panic and disaster, or do we tell a story of community and help? And a huge number of young people have had opportunities, for some of them the first time, to actually help other people see, and come together to support their own communities, which is obviously has huge positive ramifications for them. So I think the stories that we tell as young people come back in that will have an impact on the way in which we both frame it and kind of respond to it as well.
I would absolutely agree with Jonathan. It's about the narrative that we're going to tell afterwards, and students have been incredibly resilient in this, really mind-blowingly so. They've been helpful with helping communities. They took care of themselves. They've really developed the resilience, and I think that's one really good thing that comes out of it. But also, I think now we can't any more delay this digital dawn. It's happening. We are now getting into it, and we're finally getting into it, and because this is the future. But I think people have hoped that it will go along face to face for much longer, but I think we can reach a much wider audience using digital and e-learning as well, in combination with face to face. And so really it could also be about outreach. It could be about widening participation. We just need to make sure that we're not leaving anyone behind and really think about about solutions that also pick up those people from disadvantaged backgrounds.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, and I think for me, it's about taking time out to celebrate successes. Something that we don't necessarily did before this, but we have made a bigger effort to do. And that's been incredibly rewarding and adds to that sense of connectivity and community. So I hope that continues as we go forward.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. That's all we've got time for. And I just, thank you so much. That was really illuminating, insightful, heartwarming. And thank you, Paul, Vanessa, Caroline, and Jonathan, for taking the time to answer these questions. And it's really, really appreciated. So thank you. And thank you, everybody who's joined to watch both live and later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Imagine a world where the highest quality learning is open to all, regardless of status, location, or circumstances. That's what we're building. We're FutureLearn. Our purpose is to transform access to education. We're jointly owned by the Open University and the Seek Group, world leaders in distance education and employment businesses. We've reached over 10 million learners to date. We're a multi-award winning team with the skills, passion, and plan to deliver the best online learning experience. We offer a huge selection of courses from over 175 leading universities and organizational partners all over the world. We make learning simple, one step at a time on mobile, tablet, and desktop, so you can fit your learning around your life. And we underpin it all with social learning. What's social learning? Put simply, it's harnessing the power of the community. We learn best when we share and debate ideas with fellow learners, understanding different experiences and perspectives, filling the gaps in our own knowledge. It adds an entirely new dimension and creates a richer learning experience. We make all this happen with flexible short courses, programs, micro-credentials, and degrees. Each course is created by a leading university or organisation and made up of bite-sized lessons. You can usually start learning for free. Short course upgrades offer access to all course materials and the chance to earn a certificate. Our unlimited offer allows you to pay once a year to upgrade on as many courses as you like. Paid courses offer a more focused, professionally orientated learning community. Sponsored courses help organisations widen participation in higher education or meet responsibility goals. Our programmes enable you to learn in depth with groups of courses that help you explore different aspects of a topic. Our micro-credentials allow you to upskill or reskill with short stackable courses that award academic credit or recognition of prior learning. We offer a growing range of accredited undergraduate and postgraduate degrees. Degrees are arranged as sets of courses which you can take flexibly, depending on how much time you want to commit each term. We also support our academic partners, public bodies, and various organisations with a range of extra services. These include course creation, quick authoring for faster course development and improved learning design, plus end-to-end support from your own dedicated team. Course analytics to better understand your learner demographics and what they think of your courses. Learner management. Guide cohorts with powerful course facilitation tools. Track and support individual learners. Income generation. A revenue share of paid courses and upgrades, as well as tools to attract learners to further study with your organisation. Employers can also use FutureLearn in the workplace to upskill or reskill employees. FutureLearn, transforming access to education.